Rosemary has some slides from this morning's presentation that she didn't get around to explaining, which are actually really relevant for the moot. So I thought we would use this opportunity, since we have a little bit of time, to go through 3 slides from the longer presentation that was there this morning, and that will lead me nicely into explaining the moot problem to you. So over to you, Rosemary.
I suppose why we included these slides, I'm speaking for Janet here because she developed these slides, but the reason these slides were included was in preparation for the overall subject matter of this 5 days that we're together, but specifically towards the moot exercise. And what it is to give you a bit of an understanding of the nature of development, but also disability inclusive development. Sorry, specifically disability inclusive development. So, the beautiful circle that you have up on the screen here, for those of you that don't have the vision of it, is a nice colourful circle that's been broken into 4 segments. There's a light blue segment for a quarter of the, I don't know, yeah, it looks like a quarter. And then there's a red segment, an orange segment, and then a dark blue segment. And what the circle is representing is what's called a development cycle, and that it's entry points for ensuring accessibility and inclusion. So the light blue point is the design phase, and that's got two interacting arrows, one coming in from the final project evaluation and one leaving the design phase and going into procurement. What that is suggesting is that the 4 elements, like most cycles, the development cycle is cyclical, and those 4 elements feed into each other. And so at the design phase, you're picking up issues that came from the evaluation of the previous project and feeding it into the design phase of the next project. And so this is an entry point to look at what are the accessibility and the inclusion issues that need to be embedded into this project. And so this is an entry point where you can bring in disability expertise. Now, me being the person that I am going to say this is where you should be engaging with people with disability and their representative organisations. And so this is where you start analysing how this project can impact upon the lives of people with disability, both positively and negatively. Positively, because you want to be able to identify the outcomes you want to achieve, but also negatively, so you don't have a negative impact, so that you're not creating barriers, but rather that you're addressing barriers, and that you're addressing the right barriers. And that's why it's important to be incorporating the voices of local people with disability, because they will understand their local context. And so you take that design phase and that feeds into the procurement stage. And so you've got an understanding of what needs to be purchased and how it can be purchased in an inclusive manner. So does it require the procurement of accessible infrastructure? Is your procurement for any engineering, is it going to be accessible? Is the procurement of the project being analysed to ensure that accessibility is central? I'm really aware that I'm either going to A, get too close to the speaker and create feedback, or B, have funny noises come from down the ramp, or B, cover the captioning. I do apologise if I encroach on the captioning. And then again, your just your procurement leads into your implementation. And so, how's it going to be implemented? What does that mean for procurement? How does the procurement feed into the implementation? And the same with the implementation and the final project evaluation. How has all of that worked? When it's been implemented, has it been accessible? Has it achieved inclusion? And that feeds into the knowledge that you then take on to the next project. So it creates this cycle of informing and identifying entry points of where you need key information and how you feed that information through. A bit like a policy cycle, that it all feeds onto each other. But these identified key entry points that you should be making sure that you can then relate back to both expertise in the area of disability to ensure you're including accessibility and inclusion, and you can, they are also points to cross-reference of accessibility and inclusion. Do you have oh, you do. Another way to check development programs is something the World Bank is now working on, what they're calling environmental and social safeguards. And the safeguards are a way to ensure that development projects embed disability into them. Now, they're in draft form at the moment, and they've been consulting around the world on the draft ESS, Environmental and Social Safeguards. And again, they're about identifying ways to embed accessibility and inclusion within development projects. So this is to give you a bit of a flavour. Sorry, I have to turn around and look at this because, as I said, they are drafted. Whilst I know them and I've read them, I don't know them well enough to not look at them while I read them out. So the first draft safeguard is the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts. So that's the overarching standard. So borrowers are to explain in detail how disadvantaged and vulnerable groups may be affected by projects, and it prohibits non-discrimination on the basis of disability. So that's an overarching safeguard that requires borrowers to work through how that project will affect disadvantaged groups. And within that, disability is identified as a group for non-discrimination. So the project should be neutral in its impact on people with disability. So in other words, it should not have a negative impact on people. It should not discriminate against people with disability. ESS2 is looking at labour and working conditions. So it's not just concerned with the outcomes of the project, but whether the project will be inclusive once it's established in terms of being inclusive in terms of labour and work rights. So if it's a project to build a hospital, are the hospital procurement of ICT going to be accessible so people with disability can work there? If it's going to be a public transport infrastructure, is the infrastructure going to be accessible for people who work within that transport industry? ESS 5, land acquisition and land use restrictions and involuntary settlement. So are those processes going to disadvantage any particular groups? So if you're doing resettlement, if you're taking communities away, sections of communities away because of land use and acquisition, land acquisition, are you removing people from natural supportive networks? How are you going to deal with people with disability losing naturally supporting networks if you resettle them in alternate locations? Is the accommodation to which they're being resettled going to be accessible? Is there accessible infrastructure for entry and egress from the community that they're being resettled into? Is there infrastructure in terms of transport that's accessible? So, how does land acquisition and land use restrictions and involuntary resettlements, what are the implications for people with disability? And 10, information disclosure and stakeholder engagement. It's unfortunate that Charlotte's not here because Charlotte understands the information disclosure stuff so much better than I do, and in fact I may have to just plead ignorance on that one because I don't want to stuff it up, and I'm quite capable of doing that, believe me. But what I will come down to is stakeholder engagement, which I do understand a hell of a lot better. And as I said, this stuff is draft, so it's newly emerging stuff, so it's best left to the experts, I would say. But stakeholder engagement, who have they engaged with? So where are they getting where are the borrowers getting their, where are they being informed from? How is that being informed by key stakeholders? Key stakeholders we would see as being DPOs, and that being local DPOs that understand the issues for that local community and what will be the impacts, what are the barriers, how the project might assist that local community, but also how the project may have a negative impact on that local community. And so it's an understanding from the local level, but also from a disability specific level. Right. So, the interrelationship between the World Bank safeguards and CRPD obligations. Again, without getting too close to that speaker. I can't even go over that side because there's one over there as well. People pick on me. So, what are the social and environmental impacts of the World Bank project? So what measures are needed to ensure that persons with disabilities can have full access to project benefits? So how are you going to measure the outcomes of a project as it relates to persons with disabilities? So what indicators, what measures are you looking for? What strategy should the... So, can persons with I think it should say, can persons with disabilities access development programs without discrimination on the basis of disability? So Articles 2, 5 and 28. For the train spotters, they will know that 2 is definitions, 5 is equality and non-discrimination, and 28 is an equal standard of living. God, I'm going to get out more. So that's a measure that you can have. So can people access the project without discrimination? What strategy should the borrower implement to ensure that persons with disabilities are appropriately consulted? So Article 4.3, are persons with disabilities being consulted? So again, it comes back to people with disabilities and their representative organisations, the Article 4.3 that we talked about this morning in the general obligations. So engaging with local people with disability. Are project level grievance redress mechanisms accessible to ensure persons with disabilities can effectively use them? Well, most development projects, the question would be, are there project level grievance redress mechanisms? But anyway, so if we come back to CRPD, the obligations are persons with disabilities able to access justice mechanisms. I think she was doing this either late at night or in a little bit of a rush. Able to access justice mechanisms if the project violates their rights. So Article 13 is access to justice, but it would have an interrelationship with what the what the project is designed. So if it relates to education, if it relates to health, if it relates to community living, you would have an interrelationship with those other articles. So that just gives you a snapshot of the kind of issues that inclusive development is about. It's about embedding disability into development, design and implementation, but also ensuring that there is redress for people with disability if a project is not inclusive and is in fact doing harm and is actually excluding people with disability from that development project. So now I'll pass over to Eleanor, and with that background she has some insight into the moot court exercise.